My guest again today is Chris Morrison.
The Met Office is a gift that keeps on giving. It the hopelessness of its scientific database is a marvel to behold. As you know, there's been concern around the world. I mean, Anthony Watts has done great work in the United States about many of these recordings, these temperature recordings. And there's been concern about the Met Office. The great Paul Homewood has long been talking about it, all these various records that seem to be set at airports. But we did, I think, quite an interesting work about 18 months ago. We asked the Met Office under a Freedom of Information Act to provide their list of all their stations, there are about 380, and a list of the class ratings produced by the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. The ratings are usually known as CIMO ratings. They're class 1 to class 5. Class 1 is pristine. They don't suggest any uncertainties, but you get up to class 4, where they suggest uncertainties of plus or minus 2 centigrade, and class 5 plus or minus 5 centigrade. And we found that 77.9% of these stations were actually in class 4 and class 5, nearly 30% in the complete junk class, where you could put a temperature measuring station next to the door of a blast furnace, were actually 30% of the total. And in fact, you might say it could be next to the door of a blast furnace. Well, they probably don't do that, but they certainly put it next to the tailpipe of a Typhoon jet engine, which is where they got their 40.3 record on the 19th of July 2022, which was 40.3, which lasted for 1 minute and then went up and down, of course. So we looked at that, and that opens a Pandora's box, because once you know how badly cited they are, you can start to analyze all of the records, all of the data. And that has been going on now for 18 months. And it's not just me. I don't claim any of the credit. We've had two fantastic amateur. I say they're amateurs. I mean, I've seen the worst professionals, retired gents, Ray Sanders, who you've had on your podcasts, and Dr. Eric Huxster, who is a retired geography teacher, but with a PhD, I think, in sciences, and a very considerable scientist, in fact. And they've both been looking at all of this data, and what they found is just beyond belief. Obviously, you know about Ray. He's been looking at all the weather stations and showing how poorly sited they are. I mean, really poorly sited, in the middle of solar farms, next to electricity substations, in car parks, next to roads, 100 of them on runways, constant records being produced by Heathrow Airport, and the Met Office wanting us all to believe that. And Huxter's work is particularly interesting. He's analysing heat spikes. He's trying to work out, because they're using very, very precise thermometers these days. This is another big thing that has had big effect. They're measuring these they're measuring data electronically. They're measuring it every minute. He's able to look at the way that these temperatures spike. And of course, the obvious one I've just mentioned is the one at Conisbee that lasted for 60 seconds and was obviously almost certainly induced by something. And if one looks around, one sees it's the main base for the British Typhoon fighter jet community. So he looked at that, and he looked at 26 days. I'm sorry, I think it was 35 days in the end of April, beginning of May this year. Beginning of May this year was quite a nice spring in this country. It was fairly warm most of the time, fairly even throughout the whole period, in fact. He found that of all the records, and they call them extremes, of course, it being the Met Office, they found that of all the records produced, that the average, he looked at the record when it's produced by the minute. He compared it to the nearest hour. And he compared it, I think, actually to 2 hours, hour either side. He found, for instance, that at Kew Gardens, where they declared, the Met Office was up to all his old tricks, it declared a national highest ever May the 1st record temperature. It was something like 29.2 centigrade at, I think it was 2:59 in the afternoon. He found that from the temperature recorded at 2 o'clock, it was 2.5 degrees higher, and it was 0.76 degrees higher than the record 60 seconds later at 3 o'clock. Now, that just doesn't happen under natural conditions. And then he looked at all the extremes declared over the 35 days. He averaged the difference between the record declared and the temperatures at the hour on average, across the whole database, it was 0.89 centigrade, nearly 1 centigrade out. Now, we did a Freedom of Information Act recently, and I've always wondered, how do they declare all of these daily averages, their monthly averages, their seasonal averages, their yearly averages? Are they, as they could with electronic thermometers, taking a 24-hour average of all the readings that you can get? Or are they doing what they used to do in the old days with the glass bulb and just taking the maximum of the day and the minimum? They do the latter, which means, of course, that they're taking these enormous heat spikes and they're using it, and these are then being loaded into their databases. So when the Met Office says that it's the hottest summer ever or the hottest day ever, you have to take this with a large pinch of salt. People are starting to smell a rat because I remember the summer of 76. It was a glorious summer because it was a particularly good summer that we'd had a run of bad summers. It was 30 degrees for sort of, not months on end, but certainly a long period. And it was always seen as the height of the summer. That is now, over the last 2 decades, being reduced to the 6th warmest. And the last summer we've had, which was a nice summer, but it was a bit of an odd summer. It was average temperatures a lot of the time, but we had 4 or 5 short heat waves. Now, they are now saying that is 16.1 centigrade on average for this summer in the UK, compared with 15.7, which is the 1976 one. And people just don't believe it. And you can see why they don't believe it, because they're using all of this junk data that they're simply getting from largely anthropomorphic sources. And the work of Sanders, the work of Huxster, is proving this beyond doubt, that the Met Office have got to now turn around and say, this data is not suitable for the purposes which we're using it, which is to scare people to death over net zero, to induce mass climate psychosis. They colour their weather maps purple whenever the temperature goes above 30 degrees. They're constantly banging on about climate change. A little trick they do is that when they give a weather forecast, they say temperatures might go up to 35 degrees, or they might, but they usually don't. Usually, if you look at your on a really hot day, it might go up to 29, 30. So they're up to every trick in the book to scare people into psychosis. The chief scientist there, Professor Stephen Belcher, has said that the number of days of 28 degrees centigrade has doubled in the last decade. Well, how does he know that? Because he's using his observations that probably have doubled, because they're simply measuring very accurate heat spikes. Whether the actual true ambient air temperature has done that, I don't think it has. Global warming is a fact. We know the planet has warmed. We know it has warmed slightly, or it's probably gone up 1 degree or so. We know that from the satellite record. We know, for instance, in Britain, that you can now grow quite reasonable champagne because the temperature is just a little bit warmer. The summer's just a little bit warmer, and the winters are slightly warmer. We know that. We don't deny that. But whether they're actually leaping in leaps and bounds as the Met Office, they're constantly looking to use their data to fearmonger, to push it out to a compliant media such as the BBC. The BBC, Justin Rowlatt, who's their head activist-in-chief on the climate desk, he turned around recently and said that there'd been this enormous increase in pleasant days. Pleasant days he defined as 20 degrees centigrade. I mean, in American money, that's 68 Fahrenheit. I mean, it's actually not that warm. Well, it's okay, but I mean, if you went on some holiday, you want a bit more than that. So a pleasant day, and he said, well, okay, I agree, it's just a pleasant day, but what people don't realize is that such increases can lead to, breakdown of the ecosystem. I mean, come on, what are these people smoking? I mean, maybe he wrote it just before he had to go and have a long lie down. So what you're getting this ridiculous exaggeration from a set of data they must know. Now, this is my next point. Finally, they must know what they're doing. This doesn't happen by accident. The Met Office system of temperature measurements is a higgledy-piggledy a group of stations that have grown up over the years for specific purposes. They're in walled gardens, for instance, which deliberately try and produce a microclimate 2 or 3 degrees centigrade higher. They're at 100 airports, which is needed for pilots need the information to take off. So they've grown up for particular purposes. They are simply unable to measure the ambient air temperature. the natural ambient air temperature. And we did another Freedom of Information Act a couple of weeks ago, which I've just published. So we asked for an up-to-date list of the CIMO ratings. So what did we find? Did we find that the Met Office had taken on board what has been written over the last 18 months and is radically improving their network? In many cases, they simply have to just move the Stevenson screen, 100 meters, into another field, and it will become a class 1. Are they doing this? Well, they appear not, because the number of stations in classes 4 and classes 5 has gone up from 77.9 to 80.1. 80.1. It is now actually over 80%. And of I think they seem to have a bit of a spate of opening stations. I think they've opened 20 since we last looked 18 months ago. I think they've closed about 10, but so there's a net gain. And we found that 67% of the new stations actually opened in the junk dump, which I call 4 and 5. They've actually opened them in class 4 and class 5. There's one in a rewilding centre in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland. This is a 10,000 acre. It's a kind of a tourist destination, but it's a serious rewilding project of a lot of scrubland, 10,000 acres. So they opened a site, and you'd think, oh, well, at least, there's plenty of room to sort of put it in a nice, sort of open area, just a bit of scrub here and there where you could get an absolutely accurate ambient air temperature. No, it's class 4. It's right next to the cafe and the loos and all the buildings for the tourist to go to. Why on earth would you do that? It is crazy, and yet that is what they're doing. So we have to sort of say, with good faith, that the Met Office is there for a specific purpose. It's there it's a government department in the UK, as I think it probably is in America. It's there to warn us about the weather. It's there to warn us about bad weather, weather events coming up, storms, this sort of thing. It is not there to induce mass climate psychosis using, frankly, dodgy, if not fake, figures. And before I won't go on because I know you've had Ray. We won't go into the 103 weather sites on the historical database that don't exist out of 300. But I think that story's been sort of well told. As I say, it's about time the Met Office has got to start. I do know for a fact there is political pressure now on the Met Office. There are parliamentarians. The Reform Party, which is this emerging populist party, has tweeted. Its leaders have tweeted about this. Questions will increasingly start to be asked, and they have got to spend some of their £100 million worth of grants. They've got to clean up their act, and they've got to stop acting, quite frankly, as silly Greta-like promoters of the net zero fantasy.
Do you think there's anybody?
And get back to science. Get back to real science.
Do you think there's anybody within the Met Office that really cares about data quality, that they really want to, eliminate these horrible sites?
I don't know of anybody. I don't know many people in the Met Office. I think Ray would say, and that there are people who retire who say that a lot of it is incompetence. It's a bureaucracy. It's a government department. I mean, they're there for life. A lot of it is just pure incompetence. A lot of the reasons they put something somewhere is they'll put an electronic device next to an air conditioning unit because the plug wasn't long enough to run the lead. I mean, there's a lot of it's incompetence, but that excuse doesn't really hold, I don't think, anymore, because for the last 18 months people have been on their case. Yes, I think there are scientists there. I get 1-2 tweets. I try and follow them up who say, "Oh, Chris, if I used to work at the Met Office for 20 years, if only you knew how." Well, who knows? Who knows? I mean, any sentient person would realise, if you're working inside the Met, and certainly outside, is that what they're doing is not very good work. It can be, particularly, as I say, it didn't really matter a few years ago because we knew it was a higgledy-piggledy. It grew up for specific reasons. It didn't have to be. They used glass bulb thermometers, which were accurate to maybe a tenth of a degree, if that. But it didn't really matter because they were there for specific purposes. What has changed is they're using very accurate thermometers that literally pick up every gust of anything that's going. And they have weaponized it in the interests of net zero and suggesting that it's producing an ambient air temperature when it patently isn't. And I just say finally, remember that when you see the global temperature, the idea that we're going to 1.1, 1.2, whatever they want to say, it's full of, I suspect, Met Offices around the world who are doing exactly the same thing. Because we know for the evidence from America, I've seen work that's done in Australia. I've even heard in some work in Japan where the same problems occur. They're not measuring the ambient air temperature, they're measuring the local heat effect from humans.
Yeah, there is no reason why you'd want to capture these 1 minute spikes, right? It would just be as easy to average out over longer time periods to average out that effect, but they're not doing that, right?
And that's the point, because the World Meteorological Organization has said with these new electronic devices, they recommend an average period over from 1 minute to 10 minutes. And it's generally thought a good average in period will be, say, 5 minutes, because if you go over 5 minutes, you'll take out the worst of the heat spikes. You'll still get the heat spikes in there. And of course, I think maybe if you average over 10 minutes, it will be better, but they don't. The Met Office are determined to use 1 minute. Why is that? Why is that? I wrote one article, I need to remember the exact figures if I can, we had the minute record around the record at Collarsby with the Typhoon jets. And we looked at, if you averaged out over 5 minutes, I think the record fell from 40.3 to something like 39.9. And I think over 10 minutes, it fell to 39.8. So there would have been a difference of 0.5, 0.4 centigrade if on that temperature, if you'd have averaged out over 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But of course, they wouldn't have got their 40 degrees. The Met Office wouldn't have been able to call it, as they did in a later press statement, a climate milestone has been passed. A climate milestone has been passed at 39.8 centigrade. It's not quite as dramatic as a climate milestone has been passed at 40 degrees centigrade. So yes, we've seen that. They should at the very least stop averaging it over a minute, and they should be doing it, I would recommend, at least 5 minutes.
So how big of an excuse is just pure laziness that they could, at this 10,000 acres of scrubland, they could put the thermometer out there in the middle of a grassy area or something? With modern technology, can they do that and they don't have to walk out there all the time to service it? Or is it an excuse that we just don't want to walk that far? That's why we put the station right by the building.
Well, they only have to put it 100 meters or so away, and they would classify under the Class 1 conditions as a Class 1. So they don't need to go out into the scrubland. They just need to take it away from the facilities, if you like. And the car park goes next to a car park. That's right. In fact, the only car park in the rewilding centre they put it next to. I mean, you've got to be a genius to do that, haven't you? I try not to veer into the world of conspiracy theories, but you can't help it sometimes. Or it's been put there deliberately. So yes, of course you could. I think the reason I think Anthony Watts explained that you've got to run an electric cable out to it. And you start running cables, you've got to sort of monitor it, you've got to sort of service it occasionally, and you've got to run it out there. You've got to dig a trench, and it all costs money, and if you're going to do it properly. So that is why they're often just plugged into the wall next to the air conditioning unit. But okay, fine, that's why you're doing it. It's incompetence. It might be budget saving. Who knows? I don't think the Met Office, by the way, is short of budgets. I mean, I think its budget is £300 million a year. It's got a wonderful campus down in Exeter. Apparently, it's magnificent. I mean, it's you could stay there as a hotel, probably. I think I don't know if it's got swimming pools and saunas, but I mean, it is certainly a magnificent new building that they had to move into, and so I don't think there's any shortage of money. I mean, running a electric cable 100 yards, I'm sure the budget could stretch to that, but obviously it doesn't for some reason, and I think it's not for me to speculate. It's for the Met Office to explain.
And again, to be clear, it was warm here in the 1930s, and 1976 was warm. And the technology used in either of those time periods, it would not capture these spikes at all, would it? If there was something that a spike of 0.6 in 1 minute, it wouldn't show up at all, would it?
No, because the old, they call it liquiding glass bulb thermometers, I think they call them, which is usually mercury. What would happen is that someone will go out at once a day, and there'd be two readings. It would show that little something would stick at the maximum and something would stick at the minimum. And what you did when you went out to read it every day was you read the maximum and you read the minimum. And they were calibrated to a tenth of a degree, I think. Well, if the chap's eyesight or whoever did it wasn't that good, he might, get it wrong to a sort of a fifth of a degree. But basically, they were measuring it to that level. These things, these new thermometers, they're wonderful. They are truly wonderful. They measure to 5 decimal points. 5 decimal points. So you get a pretty accurate record of whatever's coming along. It's not the accuracy that is the problem. In fact, you could argue the previous ones were inaccurate. It's what they're measuring. And of course, they're picking up every single gust of wind, every single something, so they're picking up a generally higher temperature if you've increased generally. But it is the heat spikes that seem to be as much of a problem as just the general warming area. If you take your measurements in St. James's Park, which is right in the middle of London, it will be, we know that the cities are 2, 3, 4 centigrades warmer. So you've already got that urban heat effect, which doesn't seem to be discounted a great deal. You've already got that. Then you've got the heat spikes on top. Now, again, if it wasn't for a certain amount of data elsewhere, satellites, and also anecdotal, the fact that we can see, wine-grown areas in southern Britain are slightly more suited than they were 50 years ago. If it wasn't for that, I'd be tempted to say there's no global warming at all. It's just all made up. And I do see that on Twitter increasingly and social media, people saying, well, there's no global warming. I think there is global warming, and I don't see there's nothing wrong with it. Thank goodness there is global warming. I think that the temperature from the Little Ice Age, when we have anecdotal evidence, we have the fact that the River Thames in England, I think, froze 6 times in the 18th century. That I can't imagine that happening now. We just don't get cold enough winters. So we know there has been warming from the mini ice age, what do you want to call it? And the clue to the warming is in the phrase mini ice age. We're coming out of the mini ice age, and we probably, taken on board a degree of centigrade of warming, probably taken us back to what it was in medieval times, probably not quite as hot, they think, as Roman times, and certainly not as hot as it was 8,000 years ago when the ice all started to melt in the Northern Hemisphere. So we've seen these ups and downs. Of course, we then get the climate gate story of science, where they produce these hockey sticks, where they take away the medieval warm period, and they take away the ice age, and they had this enormous hockey stick that goes up, and apparently it's the work of a couple of tree rings or something. I don't know what excuses they gave. I just gave up in the end. I mean, it was just so laughable. But you see that sort of work is still being done. The great hockey stick, and they're constantly sort of downplaying any heating there was in the past. And I mean, even the Hackrup, which is the Met Office global site, given the fact that they're using all this data that, as I say, is little more than a joke as far as I can see, they load it into Hackrup, and there have been, I think, 2 revisions in the last 20 years, each of which they've added more warming. More warming. That's not enough already. We want more warming. You just look at it and think, what, I think until recently, I think that nobody noticed. They got away with it. The world was in this grip of a Greta-like hysteria. The world, we're all going to die and everything. And this is what we could possibly sort of go on to, that as far as I can see, net zero is dead and buried. I mean, it's on its last death throes, not in this country, alas, because we have a neo-Marxist government that, as you know, net zero is, as it has been described, as a watermelon. It's green on the outside and red on the inside. It's essentially a command and control mechanism. Once you control the energy, you can control everybody. And we can see that because of what they say, that you will not eat meat, you will not, fly, you will not have personal transport, you will be cold, poor, and you will like it because, we're saving the planet and all this nonsense they come up with. So I think, while net zero, but again, if you're a historian, as I am, or to the history degree, that these scares have occurred countless times in the past. We're prone to sitting on mountaintops and saying the world will end, and then we all have to come down from the mountaintop and say, well, no, I got the date wrong, whatever. all this sort of thing. That it's been going on countless times, and this was one more period that I think history will see as where this occurred. We're now coming out of it, and I'm afraid people like the Met Office are going to look, and the BBC, who are simply act as their messenger. Every record they declare is simply trumpeted by mainstream media. They're all going to start looking a bit stupid. Again, I say we have a problem in this country because we have a more or less Marxist government that still regards net zero as all their dreams come true because of the control that it gives them over everything. In America, of course, it's just turned on its head. You got rid of the Democrat people, the Bidens and the Democrat regulators. You now got Mr. Trump in charge, who thinks the thing is a scam. And so it appears to quite a lot of other people. And even if they don't think it's a scam, they think, oh, well, we've done all the hair shirt bit and, oh, you mean that I'm not going to be able to eat a steak? Oh, you mean it's going to cost me $3 or extra on my petrol? Oh, I don't think I like any of that. So it's all gone. It's all gone. And also I was reading on WhatsApp some interesting articles in places like the New York Times, where they pretty well admit that it's not like it was. It has just disappeared. I'm looking forward. I'm a dreamer going to a COP conference, but I quite fancy going to this one in Brazil. I mean, I suppose maybe I'm just a bit mischievous. I like to intrude on private grief because it's going to be hilarious. It's going to be hilarious. Yeah, the whole Paris Agreement has completely fallen away. I mean, even all these sort of declarations the countries are making, they aren't making any, and they're pretending to make them. And I mean, how they're going to spin this one, I don't know. How they're going to spin it for anything other than a complete collapsing chaos. And of course, all the politicians have stayed away. They stayed away from the last one. The only people who went was, for some reason, our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. But there's nobody else there he knew. And they all stayed away. So it is collapsing. And as I say, a lot of the, I think that I would suggest a lot of the scientists are going to have to go back to actually doing proper science, including the UK Met Office.
So you mentioned Anthony Watts a time or two, and I just had time to look up this very interesting quote. He was on my podcast about a year ago, and I asked him, do you think the U.S. really is warmer this year than it was in the 1930s? And his answer was no. And this is from a guy who's done, he probably knows as much about station quality as anybody.
Yeah. I think that you could possibly make an argument for that in America because, of course, he's not comparing the global temperature. Yeah. The global temperature, takes in the average in the middle of Antarctica as well, but if you look at the continental mass of the United States, a large land mass, you had, the Dust Bowl, you had horrendous temperatures in the 30s, and you can see that the temperatures were often higher. So you may well be able to argue, yes, that the in that particular landmass, the temperatures were warmer. We know in Antarctica, this always gets me, the ice always gets me. I write about the ice a lot because we know that in Antarctica, the temperature hasn't risen for 70 years. And those 70 years are the 70 years we've been looking at it. So it could well not have risen for the last million years for all we know, whatever. The ice, the sea ice in the Arctic. This is another wonderful story that's having to be covered even in The Guardian. We've been banging on for years about how the sea ice extent has been on pause since about 2007. Hasn't actually got the extent has plateaued there. It's cyclical. It was much lower in the 50s. It went up quite high in the 79 when they start measuring. Then it dropped quite a bit. And it's plateaued since 2007. And every time you say that, climate denier and all this sort of nonsense, they go, and you say, yeah, but look at the graph produced by the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Colorado. You can see it. I mean, they do always run a linear line all the way down from 79, which was the high. But if you look from 2007, if you draw a line from there, you'll see that it's flat. And I'm sorry, it is flat. You could call me a denier all you like. You can see that I got it wrong. We were even sort of corrected by BBC have a sort of fact-checking statistical program. And I mentioned that there was one day in the Arctic that I forget exactly what it was in January. It was a particularly high, it was a particularly low temperature. It hadn't been that low for 20 years. So I used that simply as a journalist to attract a bit of attention by putting it in the first paragraph. And then I wrote the rest of my article about how we don't cherry pick because, we're trying to find, we're not mainstream media, we're trying to find trends here. So the rest of the article was about the trends, and this brought in all. So they picked up on this one article and then produced a sort of a 10-minute slot about how, yes, well, it was actually true, that figure, but you've got to look at the trends, and they did all this. But their trends weren't the same as my trends. Their trends were somehow, yes, it might have paused a little bit, but it's going to start again. Our models tell us it's going to start again. It's all going to be gone in 2050, and then they go on about the thickness of the ice. They say, oh, but the ice is thinner, you see. And the trouble with that is that nobody can actually tell. You can't actually tell from the satellites if the ice is actually thinner or not. And also the Arctic is a very large place. So if you've gone around, measuring it, so you get all this, and it's like they're sort of they're wriggling on a stick, trying to get out of it. But now there's an article in the Guardian has had to admit there's another paper coming out. Oh, there was a paper, Mike England is called, Dr. Mike England from the University of Exeter. He's done some quite good work on this. And he pointed out, obviously, that it's paused, and it's paused across every month, in fact, not just in September, the minimum. And then he said, but he then suggested that his models had showed this quite clearly. Talking about your models were responsible for David Attenborough in 2022 on a BBC, sort of wildlife program, saying that by 2035, scientists say, you put that in quote marks, of course, scientists say all the ice, the summer ice, will be gone by 2035. And we looked up that story. In fact, we wrote about that story. And of course, he was using computer models. These are the computer models that, according to Dr. England, sorry, are apparently showing that this pause is not a surprise at all. And in fact, it's merely a pause on the way to ice Armageddon. I mean, they just don't make it up. Another one that we've been looking at is the AMOC, which is the, if I can always remember this correctly, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, better known perhaps as the Gulf Stream. It's more than that, but essentially it's the Gulf Stream. And of course, we've been, ever since the day after tomorrow, when the Gulf, it stopped and everyone was plunged into this sort of permanent winter. It's been a favourite of theirs. And in fact, they recently, a few loonies, the pink hair and the drippy retired vicars in the Church of England were standing outside the BBC saying something about stop the AMOC bomb, and of course you get the scientists say, quotes again on the BBC, that it will probably stop soon, possibly as soon as 2025. This was last year, of course, so obviously it hasn't stopped yet. So they come out with all this, and they use obviously computer models. And they say that there's a good chance it might stop moving. A paper recently from, I think it was published in Nature, found that the Gulf Stream has remained the same strength for the last 60 years. They were able to measure the heat in the atmosphere and various proxies, and they would use it. So they come out and say that it's been the same strength for 60 years. It's completely ignored in the mainstream media. Another group of scientists looked at the warm water actually coming from the Gulf that passes through Florida and the Bahamas. And they were able to measure that. They have some sort of telecommunications pipe that somehow they managed to get measurements going back 40 years. They found the same amount of warm water that's coming through as always has. And so you have all of these scares constantly going on, all of them debunked. And I think people, even on this side of the Atlantic, certainly in the States, have just got fed up. They look at these people and think, we're not children. For 40 years, you've been telling us all these stories are going to happen, and you're still doing it. And nothing serious has happened. We don't know what's going to happen to the climate. Of course we don't. We don't know there might be a great disaster just around the corner. Might get hit by a meteorite. But, statistically, we know from if looking at the past is that we probably won't. And that's all you can do,
So you mentioned the BBC, and I'm just looking at an article here that you published yesterday about this BBC Moral Maze program, where there was tons of net zero insanity, but there was some sanity also. Is that a change that the BBC is allowing a little bit of sanity, or no?
It is quite odd. They wouldn't allow me on, of course. I've not had the call yet, and I don't expect it. If I did get the call, I'd suspect a trap. You know, I would say, look, I want to be in charge of the mute button. I want it to go out live. But no, to be serious, even the BBC net zero. We have such a madman in charge of the energy department. You probably heard of Ed Miliband, a real Marxist zealot. There's no other word to describe him. And he is ruining the car industry. He's ruining our energy industry. He's ruining our North Sea oil. Revenues are going down. Companies are closing refineries. He's going to destroy, if he's allowed to carry on, he's going to destroy our industrial base. And of course, people, even in the Labour Party, realise this and are starting to pull back. So there is starting to be some sort of pullback. And the BBC does sometimes debate the effects of net zero. They can hardly not debate it. When energy prices are going through the roof, we have the highest electricity prices in the world. Industry is closing because of it. They can hardly not. And so they will debate it. They will, come up with the usual mantra that the energy price is determined by gas, which is this nonsense they come up with, ignoring the fact that the wholesale price of electricity is determined by the marginal cost of gas. But that is only a third of the price of electricity in this country, because 2/3 of it is all the subsidies. And we pay £15 billion a year as individual electricity consumers on our bills every year to pay for all these wretched subsidies for the windmills and the solar farms and all that sort of stuff. So the BBC will allow people who come on and dispute that. Now, the Moral Maze one, I mean, it was a waffle fest. Why do you need to debate net zero and the idea that you're going to close down industrial society? I mean, you don't need philosophers. You just need someone to say, go away, sod off. I mean, you don't need philosophy. You don't need Immanuel Kant, as a lot of the program was about. You don't need to sort of look at the Greek philosophers. Just say, stop it, go away, sod off, or slightly stronger language. So there's a lot of waffle, of course. I mean, the program itself, to be fair, it is a maze, So there was that. But they have this woman called Ella Whelan, who comes from the Spiked Online Brigade, which is an interesting online blog crowd. I don't think she works there anymore. I think she's, but she's here in the Telegraph. They are sort of libertarians, and they sometimes have a left-wing bias or a left-wing view of the world, but you wouldn't necessarily notice it in a lot of the copy they produce. And they are fervently against net zero. And she now is. This is the interesting thing I find. When I first started writing about this 4 or 5 years ago, I think I might have told you I came out of a sort of retirement. I was a financial journalist. There weren't people like Ella Whelan. There were very few mainstream media who would even sort of countenance, questioning net zero. Even if they did, it would be, oh yes, but we still want to save the planet and all this stuff they come up with, and net zero is going to be hard, but we got to do it. It was that sort of thing. And well, windmills are not perhaps the best, and oil was great, but we got to do it, and all that. That's all gone now. And Ella Whelan came out straight away with the program that net zero was essentially something that gave them a warm glow at middle-class dinner parties, vegan sustainability dinner parties. And then she pointed out that half the world was starved. Now, that is I've written articles about that myself over the last 2 or 3 years, that a number of people have said that. It's fairly obvious if you take away fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, from their use in producing natural fertilizers, then you will reduce crop yields possibly by half. And if you do that, then billions of people will die. And it's been said before. Patrick Morrison said it. Happer and Linzen wrote a paper where they went in detail about it. Nobody has denied it. Nobody has produced any sort of sustainable argument that what is said is wrong. They talk about, well, better organic techniques and whatever. It's just whistling in the wind. That we know that if you take away these fertilizers, there will be huge reductions in food supply. So what did they do on the Morrison? She dropped this sort of little bomb in it. And at the time, she was talking to a rather withering Oxford professor. And she sort of paused, and I think I quoted it. She says something about, but billions will be at risk of climate change. So this is a woman who says, I'll debate anything. I'm a great philosopher on this sort of thing. She was in answer to a specific claim that 4 billion people will die. She used a very unspecific claim that billions of people are somehow at risk, whatever that means, from climate change, whatever that means. So, and that really summed up the whole program. There was the priest, Giles Fraser. He's a lefty priest, often heard on BBC Media. And he used the word, he said, if this stuff is real, by which he meant climate change, the threat is existential. So, and he then had earlier said that the world, to be fair to him, he's quite clear. The world, you will have to get poorer, less secure, colder. So he is basically arguing for world poverty. This is a Church of England vicar. He's arguing for world poverty on the basis of an if. Now, as I say, this is supposed to be a sort of highbrow, sort of moral, philosophical program. I've seen more intellectual content in a 10-year-old, a toddler or a toddler class almost. It's just junk, and they are completely tied up. They don't know how to react to the bold facts. They don't know how to react to the science because they haven't been able to debate it for 40 years. The BBC do not allow any debate over the science. And incidentally, there was no debate over the science, even though they were constantly claiming that the science was settled and all the science told us this. You're not allowed to debate the science. And everything else is based on a premise of computer models that we know are really not up to the job, and wishes and virtue signaling. The whole thing is collapsing, and it's collapsing on itself, on its ludicrousness. No, we know Giles Fraser, he could use this platform, great virtue, telling everybody how it is. But we found this in America. We know the polls will show that the vast majority of the population are not willing to spend anything on changing their lifestyle. It's as simple as that. You can say it all you like. You can have all the sort of highbrow programs on the BBC, and you can cancel debate, and you can do that. It ain't gonna happen. It's as simple as that.
So before I forget, I want to just give you some more praise on your articles you've written for the Daily Skeptic. I'm looking at the list here. I'll put the link. I'll put the link in the show notes. But I like the straight talk in your articles, and then the headlines are fantastic. And here's one example: Global Climate Database fed with junk data from RAF Air Base, where helicopters hover over the thermometer. I love it.
Yeah. And I don't make these things up. We had a video of the helicopters hovering over the Stevenson screen.
Yeah, that's
why am I gone back to journalism? I mean, I was retired. Why am I gone back? This is just. And in fact, I should be very upset with when net zero ends, because maybe I'll be out of a job again. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
But you're clearly enjoying what you're doing, right?
Well, I mean, it's what I do. I mean, it's what I started as a journalist in my mid-20s, and I was always an investigative journalist. I was an investigative financial journalist. I actually had my own publishing company because I bought the publication that I was editing, and over 17 years it morphed into a nice little publishing company, mainly in the financial area. And then I sold up, and then I retired, and so it's what I do, and it's good fun. And as you do get a little bit older, it keeps your brain cells ticking over, and I think it's important work, to be fair. I don't actually take any money for it, because the Daily Skeptic, like a lot of publications, we get very hard hit, or we used to, by all of these groups well funded by the left-wing philanthropists that go after the advertising that we should be getting, because we have an enormous circulation. And so the fee that I was being paid, I kicked back into the Daily Skeptic coffers, because and we use it to try and bring on young people. We got 2 or 3 very good journalists starting. We got a podcast, and we try and also pay journalists, pay them a decent rate, because so much of journalism these days is internships. People are working for nothing. You're losing that working class base, because a lot of the kids who become journalists come from well-off parents. Same with pop stars, by the way, as well. All the bands seem to be sort of in this country public school boys, and whatever, because that's how you can spend 2 or 3 years, and actors 2 or 3 years not earning anything. And it's the same in journalism these days. And so the money that Toby Young, as the editor, was paying me, I kicked back in order to help, if I can, in some way, give a start to the younger people coming into the business. Because I've had my career in the sense that my main career where I was earning money. So yes, I'm doing this because I actually find it really. As you know, you probably gathered I'm a sort of half glass full kind of guy. I mean, you go into journalism because you enjoy the mischief. You enjoy the gee whiz. You enjoy writing good headlines that people say, what? What? You enjoy a good story. It's like the chase, the hunt. That's the mischief side. The serious side is that, as I say, I'm now a science journalist, which I never thought I would be. I'm not a scientist. I'm a student of scientists, and science is a serious subject. And I read a lot of very serious science works, and I analyze it. But I'm always trying to use, if you like, popular journalism techniques to tell the story to people outside, to make something that can be difficult to understand, or is written in difficult language, to try and present it in clear terms that grab the reader, interest the reader. But that's what I've been doing all my life.
So the narrative is that you must be wallowing in just piles of cash from the fossil fuel industry, and you probably hate kids too. But then there's this whole thing covering climate now that's well funded, that their whole, I guess, their thing is to push the climate scam across all sorts of media. Then there's this other guy you wrote about. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Colin. He is the complaints director at the BBC, specializing in climate change. That's what he does. Do you want to talk about covering climate now at all?
Well, this one actually that was part of the article, but the main article was about an operation called the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, which is it's part of a wider operation run by the Thomson Reuters, but it's heavily funded by all the usual suspects, all the green blob billionaire foundations, the philanthropists, and this sort of thing. In the case of this course they run, it's a 6-month course, which I call it a grooming course, a climate narrative grooming course, where they teach them, how to write the right thing, and they give them suggestions. And there was one during the course. There was one suggestion that they write an essay based on how mangoes or a similar fruit are less tasty this year than last year because of climate change. Grown-up adults given this garbage, we actually did a grok. I said to grok, give me 200 words about how mangoes taste less tasty this year due to climate change. So he did, and it was all the usual stuff, droughts and all that stuff. I said, grok, give me 200 words about how mangoes this year are more tasty this year than last year due to climate change. So I got this perfectly good 200-word story about how the world is greening and there was more CO2 and blah, blah, blah. I mean, the fact is that people who go on these wretched grooming courses, you might as well just fire them all because you can get AI to do it. I mean, the garbage they're writing, just the narrative rubbish. And they're taught basically this narrative rubbish. There are 100 of them from all over the world, and they have this 6-month indoctrination course. And as I call one of the indoctrinees was a Colin Trieger, who is actually the climate change complaints director at the BBC. Now, I wouldn't dream of complaining to BBC because, I have more interesting things to do, like watching paint dry and more productive things. But people do. They point out all the errors. Now, the Oxford Climate Journalism Network actually states that it is just for journalists. It just says, so we wrote a story about this chap earlier on, and he's just signed up. He's the complaints director. What's that got to do with journalism. I mean, so we wrote the story, and the BBC wrote back. The BBC, they don't often, but the press office wrote back. The usual thing: your article is littered with errors and all this sort of thing. He actually said that he wasn't the complaints director. So we just quoted this in this particular story, the story I rewrote. I was writing about something else, covering climate now as well. I said, well, this might be news to Mr. Trigger, because in his CV that he gave to the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, it said complaints director in change of climate change or something, So I don't know what's going on there. I think the BBC was just embarrassed that their complaints director was being groomed in the usual way on one of these courses. But it was a longer article, because we then looked at the worldwide grooming that you have for journalism. And why does the same story, it was a serious story, why does the same story appear all over the world suddenly? And why is it all written in the same way? And as I mentioned earlier, can't we just get AI to do it? It would be simpler and cheaper anyway. But so you see this, and because there is this enormous grooming operation, and Covering Climate Now is one of them. They've signed up 500 media participants, and they basically give you print ready copy. A lot of, as I mentioned earlier, there's not as much money in a lot of publishing as perhaps there used to be. Or it's more widely spread. There's just much more publishing outlets, and so a lot of these operations are cash strapped, and they will just take any old rubbish. And you get people like, I think it's Climate Central run this tool where they send it to say a local newspaper there was one they sent in Wiltshire, I think, in England. You can type in your location, and you can see when you're going to be underwater from sea level rise. And it's a sort of sea level rise tool. And so you get stories that there was one I think it was the Wiltshire Times, that Gloucester Cathedral would be underwater by 2050. So everybody in the area is all frightened and, saying their prayers or whatever they have to do to keep the water away from. I looked up the latitude of Gloucester Cathedral. It's 19 meters above sea level. I mean, at the moment, there is some debate about sea level rise. Some people say it's as low as 2, 3, 4, depends on measure you use. But 19 meters by 2050, and this garbage is put out by these people, and it's all funded by the same green blob knot. Climate Change Now is another one. They give helpful ways to explain, inconvenient things. They say hurricanes. This year's hurricanes is an incredible story. I mean, there haven't been any hurricanes. Has climate change stopped hurricanes in North America? I think it's something like it's going to be about 50%. I mean, hopefully there won't be a couple of horrible ones coming our way, but it's been a very, very low season, which, considering I thought the sea was almost boiling, I thought, in the North Atlantic at the moment, and was bound to create, massive and massive storms. But there haven't been. There's been very, very few. So they suggest don't talk about the frequency of hurricanes, because unfortunately there's enough data now that shows over the last 100 years, cyclone storms around the world have not increased in any great measure. Talk about the impacts and talk about the impacts across the coast. So in other words, you can get, was it Hurricane Aaron, I think, which was the strongest one we've had this year, but it simply bypassed the coast. They went up the coast of America, but didn't come anywhere near the coast, So what you're doing is let's send all the children to bed on the east coast of America, crying to bed, on the basis that, there aren't any hurricanes this year. But if there is one, the impacts will be horrible and will blow away Teddy. I mean, it's just pathetic. It is truly pathetic what they do. And so there's all this grooming business and courses, and they have awards where they hand out money, of course, which is a nice way of handing out money to journalists. And they do this and they do that. I don't know. I mean, it's wherever you look, it's a left-wing thing. I'm sure you get it in the United States. We've got your president over here, and the BBC was covering the trip. I was watching it yesterday, and in one corner there was this sort of collection of motley people in London. There probably was only about 5,000, if that. It was nothing. There'd been a freedom march in London. I don't know if you saw it. 250,000 people a few days before. There's this motley band of the Pink Hair Brigade and the Dippy, retired vicars and all that sort of thing, and all carrying these, placards about Palestine, and they're all saying the same message. It's all been curated from left-wing dark money. We have a lady journalist on Daily Skeptic. She's brilliant, Charlotte Gill. And she looks in, as I look into the climate change grooming operation, she looks into the wider grooming, the political grooming, the young, attractive women with very posh voices that you hear on the BBC suddenly being called immigration researchers. She points out the woman in question has never had a proper job, but she has gone to all these classes where you learn how to speak on the media about immigration and open borders, and we're all going to die, from climate and all this sort of thing. And then Charlotte even produced this story recently. They even produce classes on how to make placards. See, in the old days, when the socialist workers, it was all sort of scribbled on bits of paper and you couldn't quite read it, Americans out or whatever, they were complaining about, Now they're all these sort of billboards. They're all perfectly made, computer generated, plastic, and they, covered in plastic so they don't wash in the rain. And it's just a few kids. Where are they getting these things from? And of course, it's all the green money, and the green money goes to a lot of people you see on the media, as I say, the demonstrations, all of the so-called green operations that suddenly spring up. This, Greens against advertising fossil fuels in Edinburgh, Greens against this. The trick they play is to produce multiple numbers of these to suggest that there's a lot of people around. Charlotte traces them all back to one house, one room in London, and of course one source of money.
So I want to ask you about, you mentioned the future of COP meetings, that maybe they're going to be depressed this year at the COP climate meeting. But I'm doing this massive thread on X about the implosion of the climate scam. I just added a couple of things on here. A couple of days ago, the New York Times Magazine said that their headline was, "The whole world has soured on climate politics." And they had talked about so many VIPs did not show up to COP29. And then they're saying that climate protests almost disappeared during COVID. And when it started up again, the numbers were much smaller, the reception much chillier. Polls show that voters don't actually prioritize decarbonization. And crucially, they aren't willing to pay much to bring it about, which is exactly what you said. So do you think that the COP meetings are still going to be drawing tens of thousands of people 5 years from now? Or what do you see happening there?
Well, in fact, I didn't read the New York Times article, but I read there was a good article in What's Up with that in Anthony Watts's blog that more or less, gave the full details. And again, it's one of those interesting things that they've suddenly worked out that nobody's interested, and they're now writing articles about how it's all collapsed. I think that, as I say, I'm always inclined to go to COP this year to intrude on private grief. And I particularly would enjoy, well, I wouldn't actually because I'm an environmentalist, but the 8-mile superhighway that they cut through the Amazon rainforest. I can imagine. I mean, I don't know how many people the BBC will send this time, but, they send 5 or 6 journalists to cover it. I can imagine how every bump along the road of that road would jar their consciences. But as I say, it's almost worth it just to sort of go down there and see them coming off the road. It's just unbelievable. Unfortunately, we won't have the chap who last year in Azerbaijan rather ruined the whole thing by saying that hydrocarbons were a gift from God. and I think the year before it was in the Emirates somewhere, wasn't it? And the chap who was running it there, some sheikh rather, mess things up by saying we're never going to get rid of them. I mean, so they've learned their lesson. So they're going to Brazil. Who knows? I mean, last year nobody turned up in Azerbaijan except, as I say, for some reason, our prime minister and Ed Miliband, of course. I assume that people will stay away. Politicians the world over. You look at, say, Carney in Canada. He was a complete net zero fanatic. He spent the last 4 or 5 years going around organising boycotts from financial services, all sorts of things. He's hand in glove with Bloomberg. He's behind a lot of them. I think the first thing he did when he was prime minister, he abolished the carbon tax, and he's keeping a bit quiet about it now. You'll find that a lot of these politicians will gradually move away because it's no longer, they won't get elected, quite frankly. The main political party in Britain now is Reform. Very interesting position and situation. That a party, it hasn't come from nowhere. Nigel Farage has been well known for 20 years, but the party itself is now well ahead in the opinion polls. And if there was a general election tomorrow, it would almost certainly win a majority. They've only got 5 MPs. They've come from nowhere because what we call the Uni Party, which is the Labour and the previous Conservative Party, people are heartily sick of everything from the open borders, the mass immigration, the net zero nonsense, the woke, the attack on free speech, which is going full speed ahead in this country under so-called what we call hate speech. That was why there was 250,000. There were 250,000 people on the streets in London last week for Tommy Robinson, who is quite a fringe figure. He's got a checkered past, to say the least. I mean, there were a lot of other people. But so people can easily dismiss it as indeed the BBC did. But there was the little girl who had been kicked out of a class in Britain. They were told to come dressed in celebrating ethnic diversity. She came dressed in a Union Jack dress and was told to go home in her own country. She was there. Elon Musk, of course, gave a speech there. Lawrence Fox, the actor. I think it was Nigel Farage. You probably wouldn't be able to live in London if there was a similar. The people are rising up against all of this nonsense, of which, of course, net zero is just one thing. And the whole idea, this sort of, as I say, middle class virtue signaling, warm glow operation. So I think that COP is a political operation. If it lacks political support, it will just die away. And I know that I know America, presumably, I'd imagine that you might know this more than I do. Presumably Trump's not going to even send a delegation. And he's certainly not going to send any money. So that once the cash spigot has turned off, all those poor people from all those Pacific islands, they're all sort of, saying, oh, we're all going to drown and everything. And then, of course, you get these science reports that says all these islands are increasing in size. You can't make it up, and the world is actually getting bigger. Because of accretion, because we come out of an ice age and the land is rising. I saw one paper. I said it was some time ago, but there've been quite a few papers that work out that the Pacific Islands, most of them are actually getting bigger. But there was one that tried to work out if the world landmass was getting bigger, and they pretty well came to the conclusion that it did. Some of it was man-made, but nevertheless. So all this idea that that we're going to give loads of money to reparations to all these islands sinking beneath the waves is just for the birds. I mean, what population in the West is going to fund that? And then of course we got all of the thing about we need to sort of give them money to go on to wind. Well, I think the delegates from Africa are all saying, but we don't want that horrible wind. We want to be rich like you are. We want clean water. Wind power doesn't clean our water and stop our children dying of all these horrible diseases. Oh, well, I know the Clinton Foundation send diarrhea tablets, but that's just curing the symptoms. We want fossil fuel, hydrocarbon powered sewage plants that will actually clean the water in the first bloody place, so people don't get diarrhea. And we're not going to get it from wind, and we want what you have. And also, in a lot of parts of Africa, we have lots of gas and oil anyway. So why can't we dig it? Well, in fact, we are going to dig it. In fact, would you like to buy it? Oh, you would like to buy it? Oh, okay, fair enough. So the whole thing is just a joke. And so do I think, I don't know, I haven't got a crystal ball. Brief answer to your question. Do I think it's going to collapse? I don't think it's going to be anything like it was in the heydays. When Boris Johnson, when there was one in Glasgow, and it was the high point of the Greta hysteria, and he was going around saying that Britain would be the Saudi Arabia of wind or whatever nonsense talking out of his out of a place where the wind sometimes comes.
All right, we're coming up to the end of our hour here. Any other points you want to make before we finish up?
Well, I was very interested. Just one small point in the. We often be able to say, and I've often been able to write that when people talk about extreme weather, which is really the main fear-mongering ploy they use these days, you've heard it so many times. Look out the window, Chris. How can you deny it's bad weather? Okay, what, you're a climate denier. All that sort of stuff they come up with. And extreme weather, because so many of the stats of like the ices and the coral on the Great Barrier Reef and all that sort of thing have all gone away, and more polar bears and you can shake a stick at and all that sort of stuff. And so they got about extreme weather. But you can always turn around and say, but the IPCC, if you read the full report, does not find that extreme weather is getting worse. For the huge majority of bad weather. Doesn't really see any great involvement of humans in it either now or going forward to 2100. It's always been slightly embarrassing, but so now what they did on the latest assessment report, assessment 7, they're just appointing all of the scientists. I use the word loosely in some cases. They're appointing all of the scientists. And on the impact, which is the one that came up with that idea that extreme weather is not getting worse, they've appointed Dr. Federico Otto, the attribution queen, if you like. This is a woman who's risen to stardom for Imperial College by pretty well saying that every event, they do this instant attribution, that it's like 100 times more likely as the result of climate change and all this sort of stuff. It's attribution stuff, which Roger Bikey says is attribution alchemy. They do it, of course, by just comparing two imaginary climates and two computer models, and then say, "Oh look, humans cause whatever they do it." Well, I think they then sprinkle a bit of fairy dust and say the magic words abracadabra, and then they get what they want. And this is a attribution science, which is pseudoscience. You can't falsify it. It was started really because of the IPCC took this view, and also for lawfare purposes, they've just appointed her as the head of the impacts. So all of this thing will change. And not only that, but most of the people who are working with her or under her are all great fans of attribution. So, but this won't appear for another 3 or 4 years, this report. And I suspect by then, it'll all be gone anyway. But Federico also, just very finally, to just remind people, you might be aware of the infamous Alamonte case, when a paper was retracted after a year. This was 4 Italian scientists, 3 professors of physics, in fact, I think, including Alamonte himself, who wrote a paper more or less based on a lot of the IPCC work that said exactly that extreme weather events were not getting worse. And it didn't really get much effect. I mean, I don't know whether it's because I wrote about it in Today's Skeptic a few months afterwards, and it did go viral. It did get a big audience, and then I remember it get picked up in Australia and whatever. Anyway, so the forces of darkness, the forces of scientific enlightenment, led by The Guardian and Dr. Federico Otto, I think Michael Mann was involved, complained bitterly to Nature and said this paper should never be published. Otto herself said that it was that they hadn't written it in good faith. They hadn't. This is her own fellow scientists who had simply written a paper, and I think they'd said it didn't justify a climate emergency. They'd written a paper that was basically based on the data. So she claimed that they hadn't written in good faith, and instead of the publication, I forget who it was. It was either Nature or Science. I think it was Nature. So tell them to get lost. Or if you want to, criticize it, you can criticize it at the end. They eventually retracted it. They retracted it, and said it didn't uphold the standards that we would normally expect. This is what's going on. This is what's been going on. This is what people don't realize. And Dr. Federico Otto is now the fox has been put in charge of the chicken coop. So, but as I say, I don't think it's a great problem, because I think in 3 or 4 years' time, no one will pay any attention to it. I might be wrong. I might be still on your podcast, sort of whittling on about all of the things that are being said. But I suspect not. I think that we're seeing the end of this net zero hysteria and all that goes with it. And hopefully scientists can go back to being scientists. They don't feel the need to scare everyone to death to get their grants and all this sort of thing. But who knows?
I mean, this whole idea of accusing people on the other side of having bad faith, or this whole faith-based science thing, is crazy, of course.
It's just awful. I mean, as scientists, I know enough about science now. As I say, I'm a student of science. You don't behave like that. You simply don't behave like that. That is out of order. You have a proper debate. You have a proper scientific debate. You can pull each other to pieces. Don't get me wrong. Of course you can. You know, all the work to pieces. And I remember Richard Dawkins, the scientist, who said something along the lines of a true scientist should be someone that if you spent your life producing a hypothesis and someone shows you wrong, you should thank the person who showed you it was wrong. That's how science works. It works by presenting these hypotheses, which is what anthropogenic, climate change is. Hypothesis is another word for opinion. You present the opinions, and everybody else tries to pull it to pieces. And if they can't pull it to pieces, it starts to emerge as there might be something in this. And that's how science advances. And that is the tragedy of what has happened with net zero climate science over the last 40 years. And the whole idea of settled science, that has been completely trashed. The scientific process, trashed beyond belief. And the sooner that the scientific process resumes its rightful place, I think the better.
All right. On that note, we'll finish up here, but I'm a huge fan of your work, and keep it up, Chris Morrison.
I'm a great fan of yours then, Tom, as well. Yeah.